folks. Welcome back to another episode here on John Chen Outs the World. I'm John Chen, your host, and I'm pleased to introduce you to Daniel Idfresne. And he is a political commentator, columnist, and YouTuber. He grew up in Bedford-Stuyvesant, went to middle school in Brownsville, one of the most dangerous neighborhoods in the city, if not the country. He's a Black male, Gen Z, and conservative. Now, Daniel is a senior at Brooklyn Technical High School, a prestigious public school in New York City. He wrote, "I'm 17 and immunized from woke politics" on Bari Weiss's Substack and the New York Post. Since then, he has appeared on multiple shows, including Fox and Friends. He is the Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism's first national representative for the Fair at School High School Club program. He's also a fellow for the Douglas Society. You can find him on YouTube. Daniel Idfresne, Twitter and Instagram at Daniel Idfresne. Thank you so much for joining here today.
Hey, thank you for having me.
Yes, it's an honor to meet you. I know that some of my audience aren't always particularly familiar with Black voices in the conservative spaces, but I know that I found you through certain op-eds. So you appeared on the New York Post. And for some of my viewers, they may be disgruntled that I check out other media like Fox as well sometimes. But you are described as a young Haitian American New Yorker, Christian and conservative. As a first generation immigrant, what do you think distinguishes you from the Black peers that you've grown up? And what marks the ideological distinction between being woke and not woke, as you described?
Yeah, so I would say that the main difference between how I was raised and how my peers were raised is definitely that sense of tradition that I had growing up. Both of my parents were extraordinarily Christian, and they, as a kid, I went to church or I had service. Since my father was a pastor, I would go to all the church's services, and so I would go to Bible study on Friday, morning prayer on Saturday, and Sunday service. And so I had the full ride, everything. My parents really were big on education, and they're just big on making sure that their children were able to live the American dream that they got a taste of coming to America, but they could never get the full subscription, for a lack of a better term. But I, as your child, have that ability to go to school, unlike them, go to school here unlike them, and really have a full career and make substantial progress in honestly the most prosperous, freest country in the world.
I can resonate with some of that. I mean, being a family of immigrants myself, my parents, they came from China, and the opportunities of social mobility, the financial mobility that we have in this country, I think a lot of people don't understand that if they're not from a family of immediate immigrants. And so you describe yourself as being a person of faith, a Christian, and then also being a first gen family. Now, I know that could be tough. I'm not saying that being immigrants, wow, like we come here and we're just ultimate successes. No, you have to work really, really hard. It sounds like your father being a pastor and all, it sounds like you had to establish yourself within a community over in New York. I mean, this is not a safe neighborhood. You're Black, but what is distinction between, I think, you and your other peers who may have lived in the country for so long, their fathers and their mothers for generations and generations? I think that there is something to be said about that ideological difference, regardless of faith. I think there are Black Christians and then there's African-American immigrant Christians. But what do you think?
Yeah, I think you can distill the ideological distinction between immigrant Black Americans and I think the woke are calling it foundational Black Americans now. And you can distill this down to one sentence.
And what is the foundational referring to? What is the foundational Black American?
When they say foundational Black American, they're referring to Black Americans whose ancestors were slaves here, versus immigrant Black Americans who maybe have, their parents, the parents have immigrated in from Nigeria or any, or the West Indies,
right, Liberia,
or whatever.
Ghana.
Yeah, exactly. And you know, the ideological difference between these two different groups uh, can be seen in how they view the word American. You know,
Mm,
there's a huge movement, a movement that started in academia to, you know, say, well, we're African American, right? Because we have
right.
connection back to Africa rather than being American. Uh, because I mean, you know,
Yeah.
slaves have been coming into this country even before the founding, and so a lot of slaves who came to America are pretty much American. You know,
Yep.
American even before America was founded,
Mm,
right? But this movement, especially in academia, to step away from that, to say, well, wait, hold on, we're not American, we're actually African American, or you know,
mm,
we're something else. As we have to put a hyphen before American because we don't feel American, versus the sort of immigrant nature of, I'm going to come into this country because I want my kids to bear the American
mm,
nation, to be an American, right?
sure.
To grow up on American soil. That's sort of the, if you want to really um, if you want to really shorten the sort of ideological divide between foundational Black Americans and immigrant Black Americans, it's really that. You know, my parents don't call me Haitian, right? They don't even call me Haitian American. They call me American. When I travel to Haiti with my parents, the Haitians there, no, I'm not Haitian. They don't
Right.
even regard me as Haitian American. They say I'm American. Why? Because I I'm more American in my culture, in the way I speak. I can
Sure.
speak a bit of Creole, but it's broken,
Yeah.
and it can, you know immediately that I wasn't born and raised in Haiti, right? And so, you know, yeah, so yeah, that's the difference between immigrant Black Americans
Mm.
and foundational Black Americans.
That makes sense. That makes sense. There's actually been a generation of Americans that are Black that have moved back to countries like Liberia, and they carried over some of that culture. And Liberia is actually a very pro-American state. They love Madonna. They eat American food. They consume American culture and are so prideful of American culture. Like they want to be American. And I think a lot of people around the world still to this day, whether it's Mexico, whether it's the Chinese or people in Africa, there are plenty of people who are trying to get into America because there is so much profundity of resources and knowledge, educational benefits, and social welfare programs, and so forth. And I get that there is that immigrant divide. What do you think as a society, though? Why do we generalize Black skin as simply you're innately liberal and you have to think a certain way? Why has that become the norm? What do you say?
That's a very interesting question. I would say that there's a certain perception that only certain policies are able to uh, help a certain demographic of people. Those demographic of people are most likely going to be minority,
Yeah.
whether it is Black, it could be Latino or Latinx, as we'll call them. It can even be Asian or women. You know,
Yeah.
and that comes from this sort of, I would say, postmodern idea
Mhm.
that that Amer- traditional American values are sort of an expression of white power, and so our policies and our policies that are anti-American in general, or just anti 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 common sense in a
Mhm.
sort of way. I
Yep.
mean, if you really want to take it there, common sense and logic is also the doing of the evil white man. Um, that like, hold on, I just lost my
Sure.
train of thought.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So the idea of
Yeah,
whiteness, if I could add in like this idea of whiteness, because
yes.
of colonialism, because people come to this country as immigrants, even the Quakers in the very beginning,
Mm,
before America was established as its own nation, right? Before the founding fathers really, established with the Declaration of Independence and our Constitution, we didn't have a good sense of what America was, but there were white people who are accruing wealth. And I think that's where progressive more ideologues will bring in that fact as to say, when we're talking about systemic issues and oppression and so forth, there is more of a surplus of wealth in the white population. I think we can agree on that. But then I think this issue economically, strictly within the idea of economics, right? Of people from Nigeria, of Haitian descent like yourself, that come into this country are able to find success economically. I'm not saying that you're like Bezos here, really throwing those Benjamins or anything. You are still established, and sounds like you're doing pretty well for yourself. I know plenty of Chinese American that are like that as well, for that matter. So ideologically, though, it becomes, from my point of view, a lot of immigrants are more conservative. They're chasing after this American ideal and dream, whilst the Americans, typically, I would say more white liberal types and minorities for sure, are trying to be disillusioned of this ideal of American exceptionalism. Do you find that American exceptionalism is something that you struggle with, or do you believe like this is 100% correct? Like we should follow through with American exceptionalism. What do you believe?
I think by all objective measures, or most objective measures, America is an exceptional place. I mean, you know, and I think my experience going to Haiti every 2 years really bolsters that point of view. The the fact that we have such a great standard of living, and we can complain about the gas becoming higher in these past few months, but still putting the gas in our fuel pumps,
Yeah.
or put it still filling our cars,
Right.
even though we're complaining about higher gas prices. That's something to say about how great this nation is, because in Eastern Europe, uh, you know, they can't have cooking oil. They don't have cooking oil because they're reliant on Russian oil, and they just got hit by the conflict even harder.
Yeah.
The fact that even when bad things happen to us, we're able to absorb it and we're able to move on with it. For a while, consumer spending was still up while inflation was up. So there were still people buying as at the same level as they used to, while still complaining about inflation. The fact that we're able to push a wall back, and that's an example on a macro level, right? When we're talking about economics, but even on a micro level, in your day-to-day lives, you can play Fortnite for 18 hours a day and not worry about whether food is going to be on the table the next day. That is a privilege that billions of people across the world do not have. This idea that you can have days off and you can focus on things that do not necessarily benefit you in the financial sense,
right?
Or in the financial sense. That is a privilege, and it's easy to forget about that when you're in that place of privilege. The progressives get one thing right. People who have privilege don't really see that privilege, right? And they may use it in nefarious ways and say, well, you're white, so you're unable to see the racism that happens in this country. But in some sense, what they're saying is not necessarily wrong. We have a ton of privilege, but we, especially in New York City, I have so many connections, and just by taking a train 30 minutes into the city, right, and talking to people, but we tend to see what's wrong. Oh my God, my bacon, egg, and cheese is $1 more now. There's so many potholes in this city, stuff like that. First world problems. That's really what a first world problem is.
Interesting. Yeah, I can see that. I could see where you're coming from, since Haitians definitely have a very impoverished, abject poverty background. If you're a Aboriginal and native from that country, and just the economic upheaval, especially with earthquakes and so forth, the instability that we see in certain countries, whether it's governmental powers, there's a lot of stability, I would say, that you seem to bring about in the American context. Now, what would you say, as we're talking about these issues, is this your main focus? Because you do have your own podcast show, sort of, where you're on YouTube, you're a YouTuber. What do you talk about more broadly? Now, you covered a little bit about power and privilege and race and systemic issues, where we'll get into a little bit later here. But what is your passion? It sounds like you're very, very involved and passionate about race ideals and economics. Is that mostly it?
Well, I would say that, well, I have a general passion for politics in general, and it doesn't really have to be about race, you know. But if that's what's dominating our national conversation, and if silence, if me being silent will cause us to, or will lead us down a wrong path. Not saying that me not being silent will lead us down the right path, but like if I have something to say, I'll say it,
Mm,
But I have a passion for politics in general, like um if it's about economics, if it's about philosophy, and how philosophy relates to politics, if it's about sort of just like uh, how just history, and how the Democrat Party dominated this part of American history, and how the Republican Party dominated that part of American history, and how America ends up now, or the expansion of the executive branch. I'm pretty much in love with it all. But
mm,
yeah, right now, ideology is probably the most important thing that we need to deal with when it comes to the health of our nation. You know, there are other problems. I mean, we have a huge problem right now with like the economy,
mm,
and the rise in inflation and whatnot. We do have a problem with the expansion of the executive branch, to the point where the executive branch executives are emboldened to pass a unconstitutional vaccine mandate using OSHA.
mm.
There's so many different problems that we do have with this nation, but the thing uh, that's endangering us the most, and that's endangers us the most, is the prevalence of critical race theory and gender ideology in our
Mhm.
schools. Critical race theory pretty much alleges that our country is evil, and inherently evil, and
Mm.
irredeemably evil, right? And we can do nothing to fix that. And gender ideology posits something slightly different, not necessarily that
Mhm.
that America's evil, but that but it pushes as more social constructionism. This sort of, I don't have duties, and I'm not placed in this sort of, in God's creation, sort of, where you don't necessarily
Mhm.
like you don't, no matter how much will you have, there are certain rules that you cannot break about life, and you're actually more fulfilled you're more fulfilled abiding by those rules than
Mm.
trying to go your own way and to make up things to make yourself
Right.
satisfied.
I see.
This idea of hedonism versus duty really becomes a huge question when it comes to whether we should accept gender ideology, this idea that gender is not binary.
Right. Now, that's a very complicated cesspool, I would say. As we get into gender, I think there is key differences, obviously, when we're talking about medicalized gender dysphoria and treatment. And then there is a social movement within the transgender ideology and social spaces where we want to be inclusive of trans people. If you identify as trans, non-binary, whatever you identify as, politically, religiously, I believe that our society does generally a good job of including people and progressing forward with that. But I think what you're speaking to, and I think giving context helps here, what you're speaking to is that people are having to be forced without really thinking through what dissolving gender means, right? Like deconstructing gender socially means, apart from sex, because
But
tradition.
even before you sort of culturally force people into that position, there has to be some sort of framework or groundwork already set for
Sure.
somebody to sort of be nudged in that direction.
Right.
One of those pillars is this idea that you can sort of, that it's what you want, what makes you happy,
Yeah.
like what's your authentic self, and whatever your authentic self may be, even
Right.
though it
Right.
may exist in opposition of reality, people must accept that authentic
Yeah.
self. This is the result of tolerance becoming the highest value in our value hierarchy, which I honestly think is a mistake.
Mm.
We have duty, honor, respect, these other values that we should probably,
That's fun.
and I'm not saying that we shouldn't be tolerant. That's not what
Of
I'm
course.
saying.
Of course.
But if tolerance is your highest value, then you can pretty much tolerate things that can be detrimental to you as well.
Yeah.
But if you have other things, other values like respect, maybe respect for yourself, or maybe
Right.
respect for religious, God's creation, or if you want to think about it in philosophical terms, if you're a naturalist, which our founding fathers was, things are found in nature, and it is not in us to sort of change nature's rules. If you have that higher in your value hierarchy, then you would see the social conditioning, and you would sort of, or the cultural conditioning, and you would think, maybe this may have some benefits. I don't know. But what I do know is that God or nature posits that mammals only have a male and a female, right? And that this idea that I can become sort of not masculine or feminine in any way, become non-binary, or have all these different sexualities and whatnot, may not be conducive to a life where I abide by nature's rules, or abide by my duties, right?
Sure.
There's a level of when you're, like, for example, let's say there's a certain burden of performance that you have as just a human being, when it comes to maybe serving your family, or becoming the best person that you can become and whatnot. And when you posit that your authentic self naturally opposes the hard realities that you must overcome to become the best version of yourself, or to serve your family or whatnot, which is what gender does in some sort of sense. Because let's take it like this. Let's say that you as a guy have a sort of masculine performance where you have to provide for your family. If you're sort of saying, well, I don't want to be masculine, or the traditional masculine guy, whatever that, and we're not saying, when I say like masculine guy, I'm not saying, oh, you got to become Giga Chad, or you know, you got to like when I mean masculine, I mean you're a problem solver. You don't necessarily, like, you're a provider. You're a rock.
Traditional masculinity.
Exactly.
Yeah. Not that it's the toxic masculine, I think, is just coming into this social arena a lot, and we try to nitpick what masculinity has done wrong. And there are plenty of masculine examples, right? Males. I think, people make fun of Trump a lot of the times just because of the way that he speaks. And generally, men have a way of going about in this world, whether socially conditioned or educated, and they do speak a little bit differently compared to women. And I think we have to be careful, obviously, about how we approach these issues around what's socially engineered and what's innate in us. And I think that's a very fascinating idea, because I do believe that there is a natural reality, right? There's a material reality that we have to live in. And what are the boundaries of that? I think as a society, we're still discussing and entertaining this idea of how far does gender go, right? What are the constructs that we can make, whether it's attire, whether it's makeup, whether it's behaviors like sports, what kind of sports people can join. Like, the very fact that sex differences still matter in this non-binary transgender dialogue, especially with Leah Thompson, that's a very stark reality we have to live with. Okay, so biological differences, why are people getting so riled up? It's because, well, one, gender dysphoria sucks. Like, no one wants to go through that. But also, women and men have been separated for a reason, because there is a sex differentiation in terms of development and testosterone levels and strength. All those things matter. So there is that material world. And as you say, the social constructivists are trying to, more on the progressive end, I would say, because you don't have to be, social constructivists, I think, is a very academic heavy tool. Yeah. And most of academics are more progressive. And that makes sense, because progressives are people that go out and they try to see what's new, what is on the forefront, right? The fringes. And I think that there are certain dangers that come with having to experiment. Like anything in life, you have to learn. Well, so, what would you say is a problem that you see, especially as we're talking about this? I mean, I do plenty of shows and talks with people around gender dysphoria and gender more broadly, but what do you feel like your piece of the pie is in this one?
That's interesting. I'm gonna get to that question, but I really want to respond to that point that you made. Yeah, there's sort of a self-interest in academics, sort of being a little bit social constructivist, or sort of like progressive, progressives sort of have that, like they have a pillar of social constructivism in them. Obviously, that's not the only pillar that formulates their worldview. But yeah, academics sort of do have a stake in sort of believing that you can sort of change things with social conditioning, because if they're the pioneers or they're like the innovators when it comes to the idea sphere, and they want to sort of make an effect world, right? They're not necessarily businessmen where they are sort of making a product and they're having a market respond to it and people are buying it, and that's sort of changing the world for a better place, sort of like an Elon Musk creating Tesla, people like electric vehicles, and so he's changing the world in that sort of aspect. Academics have their ideas, and so they sort of need to rely on this idea of, okay, like I can manipulate the world through ideas and cultural conditioning, because that's the only way my ideas and my essays and my books and my speeches will have sort of an effect on the world. And they're not necessarily wrong. There's a level of social conditioning that does really shape how we live. But and this goes into like the second part I was thinking of.
Right. What is
they go too far, right? Like not everything can be constructed socially, right? Not everything is up to the whims of ideas and cultures and whatnot, and I think this misconception sort of comes from this idea of blank slate equalism. To an extent, blank slate equalism is a good thing, right? Because I mean, like even though I'm different from you, we both have rights. We have intrinsic value, right? We're children of God, right? But when you take it a bit too far, it's like, okay, well, like then you get phrases like, well, girls can do everything men can do, and men can be women, and things like that, where, well, no, reality then smacks in the face. Leah Thomas went from like the 463rd swimmer to the first female swimmer,
Sure.
But yeah, so wait, what was your question that you asked me? That was the point I wanted to make.
So you're part of the pie. What is the contention that you have with gender as it relates to what work you do? I know that you're pretty well known for obviously talking about race and being a Black male, being young, Gen Z. I get that woke ideas like gender ideology, right? They're really hard to sometimes understand because it's so new, and people want to be courteous and kind, which we all should agree we should be courteous and kind. But when we're talking about the root issue, it's an ideology that's not commensurate with some biological aspects of our lived reality, right? Yeah.
So are you asking what's my piece in the pie? Like, how can we address this, or?
Yeah. Why are you interested and engaged, and what do you think
in gender ideology?
Yeah. Why do you want to talk about this? What's your piece of the pie in this?
Because gender ideology, like, again, like it supposes several things that are naturally detrimental to our society, not necessarily in the same way critical race theory is detrimental to our society. And on some level, I think critical race theory is a bit more dangerous, right? Just because it's the presuppositions of critical race theory are sort of just like straight blows, like straight punches to the gut of America. Gender ideology is like a death by 1,000 cuts, right? Because it's sort of like you want to be tolerant of people, and like you're like, nobody has a problem with the LGBTQ community, like nobody really does,
Right. Well, actually,
again,
I think there are some gay people who there are radical feminists who are. There are even gay people themselves who are having a problem within the community. Like, why are trans people taking up our spaces?
Really, I would say like the new community. But when I say like the LGBTQ community, I'm really talking about like when it comes to like gay marriage, or
like there's social acceptance for it. That's just more tangential detail, but just to give scope, like there are some issues even within the community, within the LGBT community, that they are disaligned from.
The reason why there are issues, the reason why there are issues with sort of the older faction of the gay community, lesbian, gay, exactly, versus the new sort of like non-binary, asexual, pansexual, transgender. The difference between those two is that at least gay people, lesbians, etc., are rooted in some sort of reality where they sort of know that there are two genders. They know, like,
Mm.
if you say that gender is non-binary and you can be anything like within a spectrum or whatever,
Mm.
then it sort of eliminates
Your
like
sexuality.
homosexuality in a
Yeah.
way. Like it
Yeah.
like
Kind of.
it eliminates, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It eliminates their identity in some sort of sense, because you're just saying like there's no
There's
real
no difference.
validity.
There's no
Yeah,
real difference in some
there's
sense.
no difference and there's no validity to their existence, because you could just be anything, and gay is just like once like certain thing within like a whole spectrum.
Mm-hmm.
Like, and you don't like, you could be gay and like for 1 second and then you can like become something else in
Right.
like the next 10
Bisexual
seconds.
and
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. And you can change your pronouns like every few, like it
Sure.
sort of removes the significance of their sexuality, you know?
Yeah.
I would say that yeah, you know, the reason why I care about gender ideology is because it just goes onto this idea of whether we're blank slate equals, whether social constructivism is how we view the world,
Yeah.
and whether we should believe in people's authentic selves,
Mm.
and whether we should believe in our happiness. Our happiness is what they in. How our happiness is the end goal. Is happiness is sort of is an emotion, and evolutionarily emotions are sort of trigger cues. It's sort of a means to an end. It's sort of like a trigger, a cue of what path you're on, right? Rather than it's a
Right.
means. It starts the mean to an end rather than the end, right?
Right.
So if you're anxious, right, that's a marker of like
You're not who you are.
need to be
or you
doing
need to change.
exactly. You need to be doing something because the end is not looking good for you, evolutionarily speaking, right? Happiness is like sort of the opposite. It's like when you work out and you like get endorphins and you're happy, like because you've taken a step, you're taking a step towards bettering yourself. But happiness is not necessarily the end goal. And this idea that, you know, you should chase happiness, and happiness is defined by your authentic self rather than obligations, duty, you know, hard work, you know,
Right.
that's something we should be fighting, because that's the difference between immigrant Americans and
right.
you know, normal Americans. It's this idea of like, I have a duty to my family. I have an obligation to become the best person I have an obligation to become the best person that I can become, because my parents did so much to get me in this situation, even though I may not be in a wealthy neighborhood or not, I may not be living in the Upper East Side. This is still a fantastic situation for me to be in. And so I have a duty, I have an obligation to make them proud.
Yeah.
Right. That's something more fulfilling than just saying, well, I'm not happy. What would make me happy? Searching through the internet and then
I'm not the right gender.
Finding that sort of, exactly.
Okay. Sure. And I'm sure there are plenty of like people in my own life who would disagree, you know, like obviously, like, especially for me coming from gender dysphoria research, I've done that in a lab, and I value the experiences of these individuals who are gender diverse, for lack of better terms. They go through really, really hard struggles, and the literature is not out, right, on all the different diagnosing or the types of diagnosis of gender dysphoria. So it's muddy waters. And I think ideology and politics comes in so heavily. Activism comes in so heavily with it when, you know, it's a medicalized idea. And I think it's extrapolated into the political and trying to break down our notions of traditional gender. So I agree. I like how you compared race and gender. And there is this central, for lack of a better term, woke drive or passion in our general zeitgeist right now to be able to dismantle some of these ideas, these traditional views about American exceptionalism, as well as traditional gender roles. And I understand your view to be, you know what, we need to have some meaning and purpose from just an individual responsibility standpoint, to be grateful, right? And it's kind of that bootstrap mentality. I think the people that I talk to the most that have an issue with that, right? Definitely from more of a progressive left end, we love you friends. There is a general sense that the country, the systems that are in place are doing us a disfavor. And I think that there is plenty of that. I mean, you're a Christian, for crying out loud. Like, there is a world order, right, against the kingdom of God. So you can understand that, and we can appreciate that there are things that are wrong with our world. There are things wrong with our government, our institutions, and it abuses people. It dehumanizes people. But at the same time, I do enjoy your central point that there is a deviation from individual responsibility and becoming something apart from just our skin color, our gender, as a way to express our life-giving virtues, right? Hard work, generosity, and just passion for creating, right? Creativity. Like, those things, I think, inspire us, all people, regardless if you're trans, if you're gay, if you're Christian or religious, and whatever political spectrum. That's a very human drive in each of us. So I want to get to the next point. I think you laid that out really wonderfully, but I want to get back to racism. Yeah, you did. I think racism is something that you have a stake in the matter, obviously, because your views are different and countercultural. So have you ever been discriminated against? And what is your view of racism today in America? Do you define it? How do you define it? How does it impact the people around you?
I would say that, have I ever been discriminated against? I don't think so. I sincerely do not think so. I think that with this sort of new definition of racism that's going around, this idea that like any inequity is a sign of a deeper, irredeemable systemic racism that plagues our country. Maybe under that definition, maybe have been discriminated against because maybe my grades have been not necessarily, like, even though I'm a high performer, I perform well in school. I go to Brooklyn Tech. I have a 90 average. But some of my white friends have 100 averages. So maybe that's a sign of discrimination. But no, I don't view it as discrimination. I view it as choices, right?
So like intentional discrimination, like someone's actually stuffing you down from or stopping you from actually succeeding, versus just statistical discrimination, like, oh, there's differences just off of, for whatever the factor is, whatever the reason is that there's a difference, there's just that statistical discrimination. So there,
I don't think
no one's keeping you down. Is that what you're saying?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, there's so many different factors that are sort of at play when you get a certain statistic that you can't just point out one thing and say, well, that's the thing that causes me to not be as good as this person, or you really can't just like point out one factor. Again, like if I'm just pointing to my personal life, my GPA, my grades, and how well I performed in school is a direct result of many different factors, right? How much time I studied, how much time I played, how much time I spent playing soccer. The amount of like whether I was more career oriented or not. All of these different things come into play. Like for example, my first term of senior year, I was sort of my grades dipped a bit just because I was just like out of the city way more. Like I was in Arizona, I was in New Orleans, I was in all these different places pursuing my career, right? And school sort of took a hit a bit. Obviously, I'm not like failing on my classes now, but like that's a factor that's a variable that caused my grades to drop. It's not necessarily discrimination. And so, when I don't think I've ever been like discriminated, like just like in an old school sense, where somebody has said you are not allowed to have this certain opportunity because of your race. That never happened to me before.
Sure. Well, that's a great sign of progress. Now, do you believe that the stop and frisk, even at New York City, like there have been studies that have shown that Black individuals have been stopped and frisked more? I mean, do you deny that other people have been discriminated against? Like it seems that studies and obviously media have covered that pretty well. Right?
Well, yeah, I would say obviously, yeah, those stats are true, but are. And a portion of maybe stop and frisk cases and times when people or blacks are pulled over, black and brown people are pulled over, are instances of discrimination. That's definitely true. But to attribute all of those cases or to attribute all of those stops to discrimination, I would say that's not that's not wise. I would say that's just plain wrong. I would say that, well, first we should look at the criminal element of the population. A lot of progressives say that, well, 30% of blacks, 30% of America are, African American, and there's a disproportionate amount of Black Americans who are maybe shot by police or who are maybe incarcerated, et cetera, et cetera. But if you look at the criminal element of the population, especially over here in New York City, Black New Yorkers make a considerable amount
Mhm.
of the criminal element in New York City. It's sort of disingenuous, or it's sort of, it's actually harmful to the ordinary Black citizens, who are trying to live their daily lives, the Black mothers who just want their kids to go to school without necessarily being caught in a shootout. Is sort of it's sort of a slap in the face to them when you're sort of when you're when you're defending the criminals and not necessarily the ordinary civilians who
Sure.
want economic prosperity, who want safety in their schools and whatnot.
Okay.
Uh,
So you're
Stop
saying
and
there's
frisk may have disproportionately affected Black New Yorkers, but it also lowered crime for all New Yorkers.
hmm. Okay, so there is this problem, like you have the injustice of stop and frisk, and people are being discriminated against. So we don't want that. But then there's also Black males who have, as we know, George Floyd just happened like a couple of years ago. And we understand like Trayvon Martin and those cases, those are terrifyingly excruciating for families to go through. As a whole nation, we grieve those, obviously. But how do you propose like we go about that balance then of, well, we're trying to fight discrimination and there's obvious cases that you're saying that's not as substantial as promoting checks right in place, like the criminal defense system. Like there's the cops, the police, the judges who are making these cases for the criminals to get high sentencing. And even sometimes in like really like very low violent crimes, right? Like non-violent crimes, people are being sent to jail and so forth. So those are examples that we have to kind of like suss out what policies would help with these bigger agendas. And there's no right angle to come in, like from an economic standpoint, from educational standpoint, from a families standpoint. Like there are some issues that we need to address in crime in terms of preventing crime and police brutality. What would you say then is those key issues, maybe like three issues that you would name off the top of your head are really big, and how would you personally go about them? Crime, education, would those count?
Well, first, I want to preface sort of, especially if we want to talk about. And wait, do these policies have? Wait, are there? What is the goal for these policies that you want me to name?
Well, it doesn't have to be specific policies, but if you can name them, that'd be great. It would be very helpful. But general issues, would you say that are really, really devastating to the Black Americans in our communities?
Oh, okay,
Yeah.
okay. Well,
It doesn't
first,
have to
first
be
I want
policies. It does not have to be policy. It could be just simply an illness or
issues.
COVID.
Okay,
Yeah,
okay.
anything.
Um. Well, first, I want to say that, like, what at least when it comes to policing, there's always going to be a level of, I would say, stereotyping.
Profound.
People
Yeah.
attributing stereotypes to certain people and acting on those stereotypes.
Mhm.
Um, but is that necessarily racist? I don't know about that, and that's
Mhm.
probably a hot take for most people.
Yeah.
But I mean, like, you know, we we go off of the information we know at hand, and then
Yeah.
once we're presented with more information, we act accordingly. A racist act would be you, John, walking down the street at 10 p.m. in a dangerous neighborhood, let's say it's Brownsville, and you see maybe a a guy, a black guy in a hoodie walking, behind you, maybe half a block behind you, and you get worried, so you cross the street.
Mhm.
You know, is that racist? I would say no. Why? Because
Mhm.
you're sort of acting, uh, you're acting in your sort of in a natural way to ensure your own survival,
Right.
knowing the general statistics
Context. Okay.
of the place that you're in, and the people who are more likely to commit crime, right?
Right.
Let's say if that black person was a old black lady, you'd be less likely to be on guard. But
Yeah.
let's say that that person of interest is now a, let's say, between the ages of 18 to 23, young, black, right? But like then you might be on guard a bit more, knowing the general statistics, knowing what neighborhood you're in, right? And so you're just acting accordingly. That's not necessarily racist, right?
Sure.
Um, uh, but if you look back and you see that young person's face and you say, "Oh wait, that's Daniel,"
Yeah.
and then you cross the street anyway because
Yeah.
you're just thinking, "Oh well, I can't be too sure, all black people are like this or whatever," then that's a racist act.
Mhm.
You're presented more information. You know
Right.
me,
Right.
right? You've done a podcast with me and everything, but you
Yeah.
still acted upon that stereotype.
Right.
Um, it is natural for our brain to sort of create models that we then use to operate in the world more
That's
efficiently.
true. On a cognitive
And part of
level,
that is
it's easier to
stereotypes.
live that
But
way.
yeah, but stereotypes is not the only, like there's heuristics, there's you sort of, there's modeling in your brain where you're walking down the street and your brain sort of knows like the sort of basic the basic structure of a house, maybe the basic structure of a skyscraper. And
Mhm.
so you don't need to look around and process that same information again. Let's say you're
Right.
walking down the same street every single day. Imagine having to reprocess the information of how these houses look, or like how these houses are structured and blah 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 and this and whatnot every single day. Your brain wouldn't have the energy for that, right? And so we
Right.
sort of
Right.
create
And it's not
base
new.
structure in
It's
our
not
brains,
important.
maybe
And
something.
yep.
Exactly, and then when something appears and we're given more information, we
Mhm.
update the model
Right.
and
The
we act
paradigm.
accordingly. It's the
Yeah.
same thing with stereotyping. And so that, so yeah, that's why acting off of stereotypes, especially if it's in a situation to ensure your own survival and to ensure your own well-being, that is not necessarily a racist act. But going into the issue thing, I sort of went on a
Yeah.
tangent there.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
No worries.
going
It's still
going
related.
yeah,
Yes.
but going into the issues, I would say, well, definitely fatherlessness, and
Yeah.
this is an epidemic that has spread from the Black community, is now becoming a more American thing.
Yeah.
Single motherhood in the white community has now reached levels where
Mhm.
people were warning about, like the same level in which people were warning about like the high levels of the Black community's fatherlessness, if that makes sense. So
Right.
back in the 1960s, Black single motherhood, the Black single motherhood rate was maybe like, I would say it was in the 20s. I don't remember the
Yep.
exact
Yep. You're
statistic.
right.
And there were people there were intellectuals who were sort of like, okay, that's a problem. Like we need to keep that down. We're now at that level with other groups in America, right? And
Yeah.
obviously with the Black community, it's gone way up. It's gone like into the
73%.
70s or
Yep.
80s, I believe, or around, yeah, 73%.
73%.
And so fatherlessness is the first thing. Masculinity and fatherhood and things of that nature have been severely discredited and even demonized in our
Yeah.
society.
Right. Men are
We
demonized.
we sort
Yeah.
of we yeah, we sort of raise guys like defective girls in some sort of sense, open
Yeah.
up about your feelings, what like certain things that like and like, oh, open up a bunch of feelings and make like boys sit down in classrooms and sort of
Mhm.
just like listen when we're more like we like to fiddle with things. Like
Sure.
I remember when I was a kid, I would like have like maybe like some like just like maybe like an electronic, and you would like pick it apart and then put it back and like take this
You
out and see if
reverse
it
engineer
work
it.
and switch
Yeah.
things around. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. My
Yeah.
dad
I definitely.
was an
Yeah.
electrician when he worked. Yeah,
I definitely believe like there are sex differences growing up, and I think that the general narrative of toxic masculinity, the Me Too movement, doesn't give a good general outlook for men. Like how do we approach this issue? Bell Hooks, I think, says it really well. The violence toward women is not the central issue of patriarchy. It's actually the violence toward men in themselves. Their psychological, their psychological removal of empathy in that sense. So I believe that men need to be a bit more open and empathetic. But that's not to say like they're the same as women, as we discussed about gender and so forth. There is that general pull in those two different directions. Like women want strong, actually dominant men, right? If you look at the types of pornography women view, as well as the novels that they listen to, right? 50 Shades of Grey. Even on TikTok, you'll see women talking about this, feminists talking about like, yeah, I don't know, or like people who are like against feminists, right? Women who are against feminist ideologies today. We want strong men. We find that attractive. We find that sexy, right? Not to say that they're domineering in the sense that you're going to abuse me, because there's plenty of those examples, but including that in the whole range of things, the scope of things, gay men in the same sense, they still want that. So masculinity is not dead, okay? I think there are certain people who are more on the fringes ideologically who want to destroy any notion of gender and like the genderlessness, right? I think that's going to be very, very hard to achieve since we are sex beings. And in my view of things, like sex and gender go hand in hand. They're not the same, but they overlap in many areas and affect one another. So I do agree. I think masculinity within the family context, that's a huge issue in the Black community, as well as Americans in general. What other two issues would you say is on the top list of your mind?
This is such an interesting question. So fatherlessness, let's see, because like when you solve fatherlessness, you solve a lot of things. I would say, so I want to say education, but I don't know if.
I mean, they can all be also connected.
I would say I would definitely say education, right? Because part of me want to say, going to college or not going to college, not the end all be all. If you have the work ethic, if you're curious, if you want to learn, then you will learn somehow. But it's not even that, Black Americans are going to college. It's not even an issue of whether Black Americans are going to college or not, as whether they're even passing like high school, or they're passing high school with reading on grade level and doing math on grade level. Our schools are pretty horrendous, especially in inner cities and whatnot. And Democrats aren't doing enough to open up more charter school opportunities. I mean, I grew up in a charter school, both elementary and middle school. I do attribute them to my success in my ability to go to Brooklyn Tech. I mean, I was able to, by the time I had to take the SHSAT, which is a specialized high school admissions test, I already knew all the math concepts. I knew more math concepts than, the concepts I learned. I had to answer in a test. Charter school, I attribute charter school more so than Brooklyn Tech to my ability to write, because I didn't really learn new writing techniques in Brooklyn Tech. I just implemented and refined the techniques that I learned in middle school. In middle school, we'd write essays every single week. We'd go through a lot of multiple choice and whatnot. Read a lot. Reading is a huge culture. It's a huge cultural thing.
Right.
In charter schools, we'd have days where like the whole days where the schedule was emptied out. You come to school in your pajamas, bring your book, and you'd read the entire time. So reading and education is definitely another thing in the Black community. Not to say that everybody needs to graduate with a PhD. I think it's better if you probably don't. No offense to you, John. But like, especially if you're getting a PhD, like at least for you, you're getting a PhD in STEM or like sort of more psychology. So it has use. Like, but even psychology as a social science is better than like, I don't know, gender studies, like getting a PhD in gender studies and whatnot. I would say just like education and primary education.
Yeah.
Let's see. And the third issue, I would say safety. I would even say economics. I would say safety, because safety leads to economic growth. You
Mm.
know, if you're too scared to go into let's not even say a Walmart. Let's just say just a store to buy food or to get groceries or to do whatever, and that store is owned by I don't know, Jack. But you're too scared to go to the store to really um like it really hurts economic growth when a population is scared to go out and to shop and to just be outside and to really engage
Mhm.
with markets. um
Right.
you know and so if safety is resolved, then everything
Right.
else sort of falls into place.
Sure.
So yeah,
Sure.
so
One example I think
parents.
of really
Yeah.
readily that everybody can kind of relate to is this contention with rioting with the BLM. And obviously there's protesting, which we should all advocate for, like if there's injustice. But then the rioting is affecting the Black community so much because their stores are being raided and businesses are closing down and they don't feel safe. They can't even make ends meet now because of that rioting within their own community, within other Black populations, right? Between the Black population, within the Black population. So I can see from that angle where you're coming from on that. I mean, would you say then with mass incarceration, I mean, like crime is a huge issue. And since high school, I've been talking about mass incarceration. I think it's just been decades long of a problem where there's a huge population of Black and Hispanic men in prisons. And I think it goes back to what you mentioned earlier about fatherlessness. We know some of the ill effects of fatherlessness and single mother homes where you don't have the same educational outcomes. You don't have two people caring for children. And a lot of the times there's higher rates of gang violence and crime, and the educational outcomes are bad. Uh, People who have children out of wedlock beget people who have children out of wedlock. And so all these things are, in a sense, connected with the systemic issues that I think a lot of political commentators on the more liberal sides are catching. And no one would disagree that fatherlessness, I would say, is an issue. I think it's key. It's just not brought up enough as a central issue. It's more like racist cops are the biggest issue. And then you have fatherlessness, which, again, liberal commentators as well as conservative have brought up time and time again, right? Ta-Nehisi Coates talks about that, the breakdown of the family. And then you have even a guest I had on recently, just actually last year, so not too recently, but Katie Faust, she talks about fatherlessness and the breakdown of the family system. So it's not like it's a exclusively conservative ideal. Why do you think that crime has this edge of just, this phrase of defund the police? That's the solution that we can best offer. Like, why is it going towards that way? And what is your solution then to this issue of crime?
Well, because sort of the dominant idea on people who are left oriented is that the system is at fault and that people are sort of good. People start off good. People don't necessarily have anything to blame for the like
Mm,
they have
mm,
nothing in themselves that they could blame for their problems, and instead is the system, it's civilization. This sort of Rousseauian idea that
yeah.
in nature, in the wild, we were all peaceful, but then civilization came, and now we have lust, and we have all these different vices and whatnot.
Yeah.
That systemic racism is a political manifestation of that idea. And
Mm,
so instead of fatherlessness, combating fatherlessness is an individual responsibility thing, right? And that's why conservatives talk about it more naturally, right? This idea for men, for you to sort of step away from that sort of from poor masculine figures, maybe to go on YouTube and to find a better masculine figure, like maybe a Jordan Peterson, or maybe
sure.
like somebody else who's more thoughtful, who's a leader. Maybe you find some men in history that you look up to. Maybe find a mentor in your neighborhood. Maybe he owns a business.
Mm,
Work under him for free. Or if you're in New York City, for the I don't understand this. take the train to Manhattan, go to Central Park, talk to people, go to the financial district, talk to people who work on Wall Street. One of my friends, he literally went to Wall Street in his shorts, walked into one of the buildings. He eventually got kicked out, right? Because he just walked in like he's not allowed to be there. But he got a ton of investing advice, and he was able to invest in a company uh, at $13, and it grew up to like $60 later, right? Now it's him just like walking into like a building at Wall Street and just talking to a few people before they eventually kick them out.
Right.
You know, like
Great.
you can find like, especially if you're in an inner city, in a big inner city, right, or in a big city, then you have connections, you have mentors, you have the internet. Use it to your advantage. If you're a female, and you're raised up in a single mother household, make sure that the partner that you're finding or that you want to find is not the partner that your mother had.
Right.
All right. If there's similar attributes between your partner and your mother's partner, then there's a problem, right? Don't go on this tangent about how men ain't the S word, or all men are trash, or all men are this. There's sort of resentment because they didn't have their father in the home. Think, this person is probably not a person that I should be marrying or having children with, and so I'm gonna find somebody who is an actual leader, and that takes a conscious effort.
Yeah.
That takes first deep reflection, right? A sort of self-awareness. Okay, where am I? All right, this is not a good place. I need to get out of here. Now that you need to get out of here, it's hard work. It's and that's something that in a country where it is said that Americans are sort of both conservative and liberal, and the fact that when it comes to voting, and the fact that they don't want government in their business, but hey, like free money or free this, or I want this as quick as possible, and that's what liberals provided, but they still don't want like the government encroaching on their like ability to do what they want, and that's sort of the conservative like side of the voting bloc, of the American voting bloc,
Right.
But life just doesn't work that way, right? You can't have the traditional values and the government stay out of your life and living that sort of modest lifestyle and like getting it quickly to government programs and things like that, that sort of idea of the American voting bloc is sort of the attitude that we have in general, like not even just when we're voting, but like, we want to be a millionaire, or we want to reach a certain goal, but we don't want to take the time to do it. That's why people who are not necessarily ideological, people who are not necessarily progressive, that's why they fall in that sort of like that trap as well, because they even though they want to be traditional in some sort of sense, they don't want to take the traditional route to reach that traditional, or that for lack of a better, like that modest lifestyle, that great lifestyle.
Yeah.
The American dream.
Got it. Yes. Yeah. Because there isn't a better alternative you're arguing for. It's like, if you don't have the American dream, what are you fighting for exactly? You're fighting for, I don't know, socialist democracy or another type of program. Sounds like you're pretty capitalistic, right? American dream and so forth. There is that social mobility. I see it here in this country compared to places like Venezuela, Cuba, in China, even. I mean, it's gotten better. China's drawn millions and millions of people, its own people, out of poverty because of capitalistic features, right, within their economy. But here's the thing: is like America isn't solely capitalistic, which I think is a good thing. There's safety nets, there's welfare programs. But that's a socialist type of mindset, right? Like the government and the taxes that we pay, just about any type of functioning society needs those at hand because it's a just thing, it's a merciful thing. So 3 issues that you brought up, which I think you laid out pretty wonderful. I think it went full circle. First is fatherlessness. Find mentors, get in touch with books and people in your life, even just investors in your, if you're in New York, like go to Wall Street and talk up somebody who is an expert at something, someone who could teach you something. And whether it's like tying your shoes or making an investment through stocks, you need someone to look up to. So fatherlessness, women, and others who are trying to find a good, suitable partner, a husband, you need someone that values you and values, hopefully taking care of children if you're looking to have a family, so that we don't have this ongoing out of wedlock situation and singleness, single parenting. And then second issue that you brought up.
But people won't do yeah.
Yeah. What was that?
Oh yeah, I was gonna just like leave a quick remark, but people don't want to do the introspection, so they'd rather protest on the streets rather than say, this is probably something I could change in my own life. But yeah, continue.
That's hard. Yeah, because you're totally right. It is really hard when you have those grievances, especially even the people in my own life. And for me, like kind of having more of a distant father myself, you do resent what other people have, and you also resent your own father for leaving you, for not being in your household. I know people in the Asian community who have had fathers that left, as well as the Black community. Plenty of people in the Black community, my friends in the Black community, their fathers had left. And that sets a really bad precedence for our ultimate social understanding of masculinity, which again is something that you brought up. So there are definitely things that we can do and we should be doing, finding good examples online, reading and becoming the type of men, especially, who can be those fathers, who can be those father figures, stepping in for those households who don't have fathers, right? Second issue that you brought up is school choice. And I think education is such a big issue for everyone across the nation. There are wealthier little enclaves that have a lot of resources, but then in an inner city, there's not a lot, and people aren't advocating for that choice to go to schools like charter schools. A lot of people fight for them, especially in the Black community. They know that charter schools are actually pretty dang good compared to the outcomes sometimes in the public school systems. And I think, like you said, especially as a conservative yourself, liberals tend to push more of the public schools and not so much friendlier on the charter school end and the private schools, obviously. Is there anything else you wanted to add to that?
No, yeah, you summarize it pretty much, yeah.
Okay, great. And then third point you brought up is crime. And I think that is an ongoing issue we have to kind of parse through and filter out. What is the discriminatory effects of policing and what is the good effects? Because there are so many people that need police, that need help in their communities to combat crime. There are Black families that are just scared, right, to go out. And that's preventing them from going and seeking those business opportunities to hang out with their communities at peace and with a carefree mind. And that's something that adds so much stress, minority stress, I think. Some people can view it that way on themselves because there's such a high level of crime. And we need to be able to fight that and combat that in really good policies that obviously advocate for good policing. Even I think social work alongside of policing has shown to be very helpful as well. But let's get into crime a little bit more because it's such a central issue. I'm sure looking at some of your videos that you've talked about it. So what do you view then of Black Lives Matter? Isn't it a program that you would advocate for, since there are Black families that are failing, there are Black communities that are failing? How do you believe, what do you believe about Black Lives Matter, and what do you think is crucial to talk about in that regard?
Yeah, but before I get to Black Lives Matter, notice how those three issues are pretty. They're pretty simple issues that I think every American should agree on.
Agree. Yep.
The idea of having a strong family, to having a strong upbringing, having a strong education, and having a safe place for you to get your work done. Right? Those are very practical politics. Right? It's bizarre how our people in government, the ruling class in this country, cannot understand that. And instead of making sure those three things are fulfilled, we are failing when it comes to academics, and it took a big dip during the pandemic. We're failing in terms of, having strong communities. We now live in a digitized world. There's no sense of community anymore. Families are breaking up, and that's part because of, how easy the government makes divorce, how easy the government makes child support and all these other different things, and just crime. And, we see in just like progressive, more democratic cities where there's a surging crime wave right now. These are simple issues that not only the not only Black Americans, but any American would
Right.
agree on these issues, right? Because it's not that hard to resolve community issues. Leave the people up to it. Just facilitate the space where people will just make the progress, right? They need a safe place, they need proper education, they need strong families and communities.
Mm.
But yeah, when and and it happens to be that Black Lives Matter is not for at least two of the three issues I brought up, right?
Mm.
You know, they claimed or they stated on their website that in that part of the website is now taken down.
Yeah.
They're against a Western nuclear family, whatever that means. The nuclear family is not Western in any stretch of the imagination.
Human.
And
Most of
it's human
cultures.
and
Cultures.
across many cultures, across different times
Mhm.
in world history, the family, right, respecting your mother and your father has been appeared in different religions
Yeah.
and different laws. Like and these people they didn't have iPhones to text each other and say, "Oh, like what did you write when it comes to family law? Or what is your like opinion when it comes to respecting your family?" These people from different sides of different corners of the world
Right.
all agreed on respecting your family, respecting your mother and your father, respecting the nuclear family, right? And in a free society where power is concentrated on the bottom levels, not on the top levels, a nuclear family and organization communities are very, very important. And
Mhm.
that is honestly why a Marxist organization would want to destroy that unit. Uh,
Right.
uh, um,
Right.
they also want to. They also want to. I mean, when they fail to live up to or to deal with crime as well. You know, their policies, their policy prescriptions
Mm.
are failures. Lori Lightfoot, she had to step away from defunding the police. I mean, she had a she did cut some funds from the police. She walked back a bit on that
Right.
now.
Right.
But there's still many officers retiring and whatnot from sort of the because they're not appreciated in
Yeah.
Chicago or in any other progressive city. And Lori Lightfoot is not being harmed by the lack of police or the crazy amount of Chicago police officers
Mm.
retiring. um she has another police unit. I mean, I wrote about this the other day for the Douglas Society, right? She literally took more resources from the Chicago Police Department to bolster her own secret force, or her own police
Mm.
force, the police force as that protects her,
Oh, wow.
pretty much.
Okay.
Yeah. um in New York City, I mean, Eric Adams is definitely walking back the anti-police policies that de Blasio implemented. We're sort of going back to that old broken windows policy. He said we're not prosecuting jumping the subway. Uh uh
Mm.
Rip to all my friends who never pay for a train ride. Um uh
Oh, man.
like we're sort of going back to I mean, Eric Adams the other day, he was calling out Black Lives Matter. He was
Oh,
saying,
okay.
where is Black Lives Matter? Where are they when Black children are being killed?
Yeah.
Black people, teenagers, young
Right.
Black people are being killed
Yeah.
by other Black people. He
Yeah.
said this on camera.
Okay.
How
Finally.
is Eric
Finally.
Adams?
Yeah.
Yeah, Eric Adams, a Democrat,
Yeah.
and possibly the most liberal. I'm not even going to say it's the most liberal city. That prize goes to all the cities in California.
Mm.
But uh, that yeah. But the fact that a Democrat, a Democrat, a liberal mayor is saying that, calling out Black Lives Matter, right? It just goes to show that even Democrats, even sensible Democrats, know that
Mm.
crime is not only like a Black American issue, but just an issue for Americans in general.
Mm.
That an issue that Americans do not like and they want resolved. And Black Lives Matter, you know, again, like I listed three issues. Black Lives Matter already sort of like they failed to
Mm.
address two of them.
Sure.
Um, Yeah.
Yeah. And then there's a whole scandal, obviously, with Black Lives Matter and the funding and where the funding is going. And
Hmm.
obviously, the leaders spending that funding on houses. And they have spent around 22 million on the local Black Lives Matter groups, the organizations around the country. But there has been people who are outspoken from the Black Lives Matter grassroots movement, right? The local cities that aren't receiving that funding, that aren't getting the grants that they are trying to get. And there's lack of communication about the funding a lot of the time. So they got $90 million, right, from the world, from everyone who donated, especially with the killing of George Floyd. And as we should be able to hopefully fund policies and fund initiatives within the community, be able to help Black communities. But you're saying that Black Lives Matter has not stood for obviously issues around fatherlessness as a key indicator of success if you have a father in the home, but then also within education and all these other areas, like it needs to do a better job. It's not really pushing forward.
Yeah, yeah, pretty much. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I mean, they're not even doing enough to address education, right? That's probably something the community needs.
You don't hear
I'm not
anything.
sure if they are or not. Maybe the local Black Lives Matter chapters are doing that, but from a
I believe
national
so. I hope
standpoint,
so. Yeah.
yeah, but from a national standpoint, all I really heard is just saying for the police, and
Mhm.
their ideas of destroying the nuclear family.
Mhm.
There's not, like, maybe there would be some good with Black Lives Matter if they maybe put some of that money and put into maybe some new charter schools in inner cities and whatnot.
Mhm.
But obviously, um, they we from obviously the scandals and whatnot, we see where their priorities lie.
Yeah. Yeah. I gotcha. Yes. And I think something that's relevant to bring up is a lot of people are confused about how I think disproportional the killings of Black individuals are. And you brought up finally, like the mayor, is it the mayor of New York?
Yeah.
Yeah, they're actually saying that Black on Black crime is a huge issue that we need to look into. And I think that's been something that's been said by plenty of others like Tom Sowell and other conservative types like Candace Owens, if you know. And I think there is this misunderstanding of actually how much discrimination is taking place. There's a professor over at MSU who does research on police shootings, and Feldman is someone from Harvard who has critiqued people for creating studies that seem to allude that there is no difference between Black and white individuals, other people of other races. But it seems like through the meta-analysis, even from San Diego University with Dr. Sandler, right? Sadler, Sadler and Cesario have seen that there is correct shooting, right? Correct distinction in college populations when they're doing IAT tests. So basically, an implicit association, like a bias test on the computer screen. If you see a person, a Black person or a white person holding something up, it could be a cell phone or a gun, and you have to shoot. You have to say shoot. And if you shoot someone who has a gun, that's correct. If you shoot someone who has a banana, that's incorrect, right? You don't want to kill someone who's just enjoying a fruit. And so when that takes place, you actually have correct shootings more so with Black individuals. And I think there's this general sense that, yeah, there is a cultural phenomena where there are more Black criminals, right? Comparatively. And that's like even, I would say, somewhat dangerous thing to say. Like, well, why? Why is that? Like, I want to help the Black community. It's not a bad thing to say about Black individuals. If there are people in the Black community suffering from more crime, you should bring that out, just as the mayor of New York has recently done. So, all that being said, Cesario and Sadler, they look at it and they find that they're the biggest predictor of Black shootings, fatal shootings, is crime in those communities, not because of white or Black individual shooting. There's actually a little bit higher propensity for Black shooters to actually shoot other Black individuals, criminals, because they're usually the ones that come out of those communities, right? So definitely take a look at those studies. I think they're really helpful for people who may have grievances about, well, how do we implement policies that are actually going to help people? I would say take care of the crime, as you brought up. Now, moving on to a secondary point, I would say, which is really much highly tied, I would say, to this issue of crime and systemic issues, is critical race theory. And I think you talk about this a lot. what do you make of critical race theory? What is it? And why have we been so worried about it? I mean, aren't we supposed to be educated about race in this country? And aren't we supposed to be creating policies as critical race theory purports to be doing? Like, these people in schools as well as academic institutions are purporting to support critical race theory because we're looking at those distinctions between populations, Black, white, other, and we're trying to create policies that will benefit people. Is there a general fear? I think that there is. What do you make of it? What is it? What do you make of it?
Well, critical race theory is sort of an intersection between the postmodern view that there is no certain there's nothing but power, and knowledge is power, and if you're the one inculcating knowledge to someone else, you're the one who holds the power, and this sort of and this racialized view, that and it racializes that postmodern view. So critical race theory essentially posits that um pretty much any uh or academic phenomenon that is Western, and it doesn't even have to be Western, but that is perceived as Western, right? Because math is also racist according to critical race theories, but mathematics is by no means a Western phenomenon or solely a Western phenomenon.
Okay, can you repeat that? Math is racist. I think we hear that sometimes in certain circles. What do they mean by that? What do you think they mean when they say math is racist?
Well, when people say that objective mathematics is racist, what they're saying is that you know Western ideas of objectivism, there's a reality, there's one answer, and you have to use logic to find that answer. That's what they're pointing to as racist, right? Yeah, that's what they're pointing to as racist. And so, even though those views or those values allow you to do 1 + 1 = 2 and not also postulate that 1 + 1 = 3 as well, um,
Hmm.
because those values are rooted in white Western culture, then math has to be racist as well.
Okay, so
And it's not only math; it's
is
like
math racist in every other country, or like that's not Western? Because I mean, math isn't a Western construct. I mean, we've been
yeah,
counting
but it's
this on
perceived
time.
as a Western construct,
Like
and that's
within
what's racist.
education, like within an educational system.
Yeah, within an educational
Okay,
system, the way math is
got it.
taught, that there's one answer, 1 + 1 = 2. There's logic to it. There's an objective truth, one objective truth. That's sort of pointed to as racist, which, I mean, you
Oh,
cannot do math, no matter what educational system you're in, no matter what country you're brought up in, you need that understanding that there's one objective reality, that
yeah,
there's a logic to math in order for you to do math, right?
sure.
But those
Yeah, I
values
agree.
are marked as whiteness,
Yeah.
and so and because again, critical race theory is this racialized
Mhm,
postmodern phenomenon,
mhm.
right? That means that math as common knowledge is actually racist because there are sort of these these values of whiteness being that's like subliminally imposed in the minds of Black students as they perform mathematical equations and whatnot. So that's where they get this idea that math is racist.
Wow.
And this can be attributed to many other things. Again, like it can be attributed to math, but it can also be attributed to policing and whatnot.
Right.
And so, but
Yeah.
the most important thing is that um there's a certain knowledge, or there's a certain way of being, or this way of knowing, and because that they because racism is operational, right? So racism, right? Ibram X. Kendi said, it's not a question of whether racism existed in this situation, but how did racism manifest in this situation, right?
Mm,
Because racism is operational, that's one of the tenets of critical race theory. You can find it as a critical race theory in introduction,
yeah.
right? Um, because because racism is operational, any sort of value, pre-existing value that our nation is built on is an extension of racism. Hard
Mm,
work,
mhm.
traditional values, nuclear the nuclear family, right? That's
Right.
why.
That's a really, really broad brushstroke.
Yeah, but
Yeah. That's
yeah,
a
it
theory.
is, and
That's,
that's
that's part of the
the
theory.
problem, and
Yeah.
that's the problem with critical race theory. This idea that every single phenomenon or every single racial phenomenon in this country can be explained by a sort of operational racism that is slyly, like, sort of subliminally pushed through the institutions of this nation.
Mhm.
That's a pitch that critical race theory makes. The problem is, any ordinary person knows that no one phenomenon happens because of a single variable. And
Right.
that's what critical
Isolated.
race theory
Yeah.
posits. Yeah.
I see. I see. Now, I get that there are disparities between Black students and white students, especially in the inner cities. You have Black students performing really lowly, right? Really poorly. And you would argue that's a policy thing. We need to change up the schools and how they're teaching, even the school options. And hopefully we don't like deviate from the standard of math and make it lesser, like not teaching.
Well, from the perspective of critical race theory, you would say that because there's a disproportionality between the performance of white students and Black students within inner cities, that's a sign of systemic racism. But
Right.
any ordinary person, or any, not even an ordinary person, but just like, yeah, any person who sort of looks at this situation in a logical way will then look at charter schools, and they will say, well, Black kids in charter schools are actually performing as well as white kids in
Mhm.
private schools in wealthy areas in other parts of the nation.
Right.
So maybe the quality of school may be a variable
Right.
that determines the
The outcomes,
performance, yeah, the
disparities.
outcomes, the disparities, exactly.
Yeah.
And so, and there's places for critical race theory. I'm not going to
Yeah.
sit here and say
Yeah.
that like
Yeah.
critical
So
race theory is all
where would
bad.
that be?
In a strictly academic sense, when you're reading a text looking for certain context clues, right? Like let's say you're reading a book, and you want to sort of and you want to look at that book in a certain frame,
Mhm.
you can look at it through the way an author uses metaphors, or through the way the authors use
Yeah.
motifs.
Yeah.
You can
Yeah.
use critical race theory to really say, okay, um, maybe the author is stringing along a few racial motifs that, and you can use like a few motifs about racism, and you can use critical race theory to really extract that from the text and really find what the author is trying to say. But
Right.
as a worldview, is absolutely horrendous, and it shouldn't be something that we should be teaching our
Mm.
kids.
I see. So I understand this problem, with people in my own community talking about this. There's people who are like pro critical race theory, and then there are people who are like, no, critical race theory is so bad for our kids. And what you see is the population difference. The people that I talk to that are pro critical race theory, they're academics. They're usually people who are either in college still or at a PhD program. And they're like, but you don't understand what critical race theory is. What you're saying is correct. People often kind of conflate this idea of critical race theory being, again, this worldview, and it should be used as a tool in specific settings. And parents obviously have these kerfuffles for a certain reason. Like, we're being taught that, at least we're seeing in the media that kids are being taught that for the basic virtue of white skin and Black skin, that you have this different standing socially with one another, privilege, oppression, right? And that can be a bit disconcerting for parents, because you're teaching my kid that they're either lesser because they're a victim, and Black parents are kind of angry about that. And then you're teaching white kids that they're the oppressor. That can be very disconcerting as well, since they weren't slave holders, they didn't own any slaves. And so I think there is that conflation of, well, how do we communicate this without conflating and joining these ideas that critical race theory belongs in these more Marxist ways of conflict theory, like trying to break down whiteness, break down white supremacy in our communities, even if white people do have privileges in our society. I think that's very helpful to consider. And I would say, is there anything else that you wanted to suss out from our general conversation? I know that we're running out on time here, but I've thoroughly enjoyed this. Is there anything else that you wanted to add to critical race theory, about education, crime, anything in general?
Yeah, I would just say that. I mean, yeah, when it comes to critical race theory, people need to understand that, especially the academics, nobody is saying that we don't want children to learn about racial history, or we don't necessarily want uh children to look at different ways of analyzing a text. We're just trying to make sure our children are productive members of society, not resentful members of society. And when you
Right.
teach children that they're a loser no matter what, right? Because you're either
Mm.
evil or you're never going to become something in life, you're creating resentful members of society, and that's not good for our nation. People who hate our nation know that's not good for our nation, and so that's why they're sort of trying to defend it and they're sort of trying to deflect and whatnot. But there's way more people who kind of like our country, and we don't want
Yeah.
our people who are like Gen Z has already been Gen Z, like my generation has already been like hit with so many different social
Yeah.
experiments, pandemic, technology, now gender ideology,
Right.
now critical race theory. And right now, I mean, it's not things are not shaping good for my generation. Let's not continue that for my younger peers, people
Yeah.
like my like children who still are yet to learn multiplication and division and study for study to get into high school and whatnot. Uh,
Mhm.
yeah, we're advocating against a worldview,
Mhm.
and yeah, we are. That's really what it is. We're advocating against a worldview. Yeah, I would say just like the key takeaway that you should really take from this conversation is that a lot of the issues that we face as a nation are actually pretty simple, and
Mm.
sometimes we become so advanced that we forget about the basics.
Mm.
Because we become so wealthy, we forget about things that makes us content, not necessarily happy or elated. Because happiness or being elated is not necessarily noble things that you should go for. Is
Mhm.
having duty and having the contentment from working hard and becoming something and uh, becoming the best version of yourself.
Yeah.
That is something that you should aspire to. And when you do that, and when everybody in this nation does that,
Yeah.
uh, we things start to clear up in the Black community and and in our American community in general.
Well said. Well said. I really do appreciate you coming on and be able to inform us about some of the issues that you're most passionate about. I think they're obviously very volatile and hot-seated issues that we need to contend to. And you're offering a very, I think, fresh perspective. Some of the things obviously are coming from more conservative bent because of your background and so forth. But I think that there are issues that you brought up, like education, crime, masculinity in the household, that are relevant to everybody. And you talk about these because people care about it. And sometimes it's really hard to, but because you're a Black Gen Zer and you're coming in from that vantage point as well, I think people will really want to pay attention. What is it that you have that makes you different and so successful being at Brooklyn Technological High School? And what are you going to do in the future too? I'm curious because you seem like you're already at such a great start. I wasn't creating a podcast and YouTube content at your age. I mean, you're talking to people on live television. What do we expect from you? Do you have any resources, and what do you hope to do in the future?
Well, right now I would say that I'm buckling in for a long 4 years of becoming pretty much as academically brilliant as I can possibly
We're on a great
can
start. Yeah.
as I possibly can, because I do want to enter the career world like knowing a lot of things. I still don't know a lot of things, even though like I'm pretty
Mhm.
articulate and stuff like that right now. I want to know a lot more things when I graduate from college, and so during those 4 years, I'm not gonna like I'm not gonna be missing from the internet or like
Mm.
yeah, I'm not gonna be missing. I'm definitely going to I'm probably gonna start some sort of maybe weekly commentary podcast where right now my podcast sort of interviews people. I'm
Yeah.
probably just gonna start talking about just like the big news of the week and sort of giving my commentary on it and sort of connecting it to
Nice.
bigger issues in general.
Right.
I'm probably going to do that for the rest of this year pretty soon, and then for the next 4 years, um, And I'm going to continue to write more columns. I'm going to continue to see if I can get more public speeches and more media establishment media appearances,
Hmm.
and just prime myself for when I graduate college.
Hmm.
You're probably I'm either thinking I'm probably going to end up in media. Is either at this point is either a columnist or maybe an anchor. We'll
Ooh,
see.
wow. High ambitions. I like that. I like this energy that you bring to the channel and this interview. Gosh, you have so much potential. And I think most people, regardless what their political bent is and where they're coming from, they can see that. And I really value what you had to say today. I think you're giving me so much to think about. I'll definitely have to marinate on some of those ideas that you brought up. But I hope that people will check out your channel and your YouTube and Twitter. Please follow him, Daniel and Friends. And I thank you again so much for joining us to be able to have this conversation.
Yeah, thank you. This is a fantastic conversation. I
Yeah,
loved it too.
I really thought so too. Yes. All right. Well, thank you so much, friends, for joining us for another episode here on John Chen Out to the World. I really hope that you gained something out of it. Leave a comment and a like too. If you thought that there was something helpful that was brought up, I thought it was really invigorating. And I hope that you do too. But please, if you have any questions, any suggestions about what we should talk about next, feel free to leave that as well. I'll see you guys next time. Bye.